flanks! Hold the cliffs!
In the treasury vaults of Sanala, scribe Yusuf's daily ledger from the dry summer of 1081 did not record victories.
Glory or divine favor.
It recorded 18,000 skins of goat leather, 4,000 camels purchased from the southern nomads, 90 tons of rock salt, and the premium wages of 2,500 armoured Mamelukes. Sultan Unqid understood that in the burning wastes of the Nahasa, gold was not a luxury. It was a physical fluid that kept men from turning into mummified husks. To launch his grand campaign to retake the northern border trade routes, Unqid had to finance the drilling of 27 deep basin wells across the dry gravel plains. A staggering engineering effort costing 40,000 silver denarii before a single spear was ever crossed.
The desert did not care about imperial lineages or ancestral rights.
It demanded a constant,
mathematically precise sacrifice of silver and sweat just to keep 20,000 lungs breathing.
For months, Qadir, a master well driller from the Banu Habab clan, led the advance guard, driving iron rods deep into the shifting sands, searching for the cold pulse of subterranean aquifers, while the Sultan's army marched behind them in a slow, glittering multi-mile serpent of brass scales and red silk. But every mile marched was a calculated risk.
As the heat evaporated 40% of their water reserves before they even reached the base of the Quyarra Pass.
The geography of the Quyarra Pass was a natural choking hazard for any army relying on centralized logistical systems.
It was a jagged limestone tear in the earth, where the high dunes of the Nahasa collided with the sheer rocky cliffs of the southern highlands. Here, the trade routes that carried precious cinnamon, black pepper, and raw silk from the southern ports were completely bottlenecked. When a coalition of rebel emirs and foreign imperial mercenaries seized the pass, they did not just challenge Unqid's authority.
They severed the financial artery that kept the Sultan's treasury solvent.
Qadir, the master well driller, looked at the dry canyon floor and knew that the sand here was loose,
shifting and hungry.
A standard legionary formation would sink to their shins.
Their heavy iron boots turning into leaden weights under a noon sun that reached 51 degrees Celsius.
The rebels had occupied the high cliffs, deploying thousands of long-range composite archers who could rain iron-tipped shafts down into the narrow,
heat-choked ravine. To march straight through was suicide.
The system was paralyzed.
The Sultan could not retreat without admitting financial bankruptcy to his restless vassals.
Yet he could not advance without sending his entire infantry force into a meat grinder where they would die of thirst and arrow wounds before ever touching the enemy line.
On the morning of the battle, the rebel archers stood on the crest of the red cliffs, looking down at the massive, shimmering mirage of Unqid's host. They had water, shade from the canyon walls, and clean lines of sight. To them, the Sultan's army looked like a slow, helpless beast of metal and wool cooking in its own armor. From below, the sound of the desert wind was punctuated by the dry, rhythmic coughing of the Sultan's conscripts. Qadir stood near the baggage train, watching the pack horses collapse one by one, their nostrils caked with black crust. The water skins were empty, reduced to bitter dregs of vinegar and leather-tanned mud. The rebel commander, an imperial defector named General Antonius, knew that he did not need to attack. He only needed to wait. Every hour the sun rose higher.
The kinetic energy of Unqid's infantry drained by 3%.
The human body under 40 pounds of iron mail requires 6 litres of water a day to function. The Sultan's men had not had a drop since the previous twilight. The tension was palpable. a silent, suffocating weight where the only movement was the shimmering heat waves rising from the sand, distorting the shapes of the banners above until they looked like writhing,
blood-red serpents waiting to strike.
But Sultan Unqid had not spent 40,000 denarii to let his army die of dehydration in a limestone trench.
In the shadow of the dunes, 2,000 Mameluke palace guards sat on their heavy-boned desert stallions, their faces wrapped in indigo linen,
leaving only their dark eyes visible.
Unlike the heavy, clumsy war horses of the Vlandian knights, these Saranid chargers were bred for explosive acceleration in deep sand,
their wider hooves distributing weight across the loose surface like snowshoes.
Their riders carried the heavy curved scimitar,
a weapon designed specifically for the biomechanics of high-speed equestrian combat.
Unlike a straight sword, which relies on a direct chopping force that can easily lodge in bone or armor, the curved blade of the scimitar creates a continuous slicing motion as it is dragged across a target,
utilizing the forward kinetic momentum of the galloping horse to multiply its cutting potential.
The rider does not swing with his shoulder.
He locks his elbow, rotates his hips by 45 degrees, and lets the speed of the horse do the severing. Qadir watched as the Mamelukes checked their saddle girths,
the leather squeaking against the polished brass of their chest plates.
They were not a standard cavalry unit. They were a highly disciplined, heavily armoured hammer designed to strike where the sand was softest and the enemy was most vulnerable. The charge did not begin with a loud trumpet blast, but with a low,
rhythmic thrumming that sounded like an approaching sandstorm.
Under the cover of a sudden desert wind that blew stinging dust directly into the eyes of the rebel archers, the Mamelukes entered a narrow,
dried-up creek bed that Qadir had discovered during his water scouting missions.
When they emerged, they were not in front of the rebel lines, but directly on their left flank, where the archers had no shields, no spears,
and no protection. The impact was devastating.
The kinetic energy of a 600-kilogram horse traveling at 40 kilometers an hour crashed into the fragile human rib cages of the rebel archers,
throwing bodies 10 feet into the dry air.
The air was filled with the sound of splintering composite bows, the high-pitched screams of dying horses, and the wet,
rhythmic thud of curved steel meeting flesh.
The Mamelukes rode in a tight, overlapping wedge, their scimitars rising and falling like a mechanical threshing machine. The rebel archers, panic-stricken and unable to form a defensive wall, tried to flee up the shifting sand dunes, but their boots slipped, their lungs burned, and they were systematically run down and cut to pieces by the wider hoofed desert mounts that glided effortlessly across the red slopes. As the sun dipped below the jagged edge of the Quyarra Pass, casting long purple shadows across the blood-soaked sand, the silence returned to the desert. The rebel coalition was shattered, their bodies left to be dried by the arid wind and picked clean by the mountain vultures.
But on the crest of the hill, Sultan Unqid did not celebrate.
He sat in his red silk pavilion,
looking at Scribe Yusuf's updated ledger.
The battle had been won. The trade routes were open. But at what cost? 300 priceless desert stallions lay dead in the sand, their lungs ruptured by the heat. 200 elite Mamelukes, whose training had taken a decade and thousands of dinars,
were gone.
The water wells that Qadir had drilled were already filling with shifting sand,
requiring another 10,000 denarii to clear.
The victory was a masterpiece of tactical biomechanics and logistical endurance, but the math of empire remained cold and unforgiving. The spice trade would resume, but the silver pennies generated would only go to pay the debts incurred to fight the very war that secured them. Kadir stood by his drilling rig, watching the wind slowly erase the hoofprints of the great Mameluke charge, leaving nothing but the vast, silent, and empty dunes of the Nahasa. In the desert of Nahasa, the wind does not remember the names of kings, nor does it care how much gold was spent to dye its sands red. It simply blows, erasing the ledgers of men as easily as it erases their footprints.